Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong opposition to this bill, Bill C-4. This bill violates the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as Canada's international obligations, such as the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. The Conservatives are well aware that this bill is unlikely to stand up to a legal challenge if it is enacted. Mr. Speaker, however, the government feels the need to push this bill through the House of Commons, wasting the opportunity to ensure that Canada's immigration system really protects refugees and ensures fairness and taking up time in the parliamentary calendar while Canada's economy stalls. This bill concentrates far too much power in the hands of the Minister of Immigration. He is able to designate refugees are irregular arrivals, which subjects them to new rules, creating a second, lower class of refugees. These irregular arrivals will then be subject to mandatory detention with no review for a year, except for at the discretion of the minister. In effect, the minister becomes judge and jury for any group of refugees which he designates. Are there problems with human smuggling in Canada? Certainly, Mr. Speaker. But the problem lies with traffickers and smugglers, those people who profit off of people's suffering. But this bill ignores those people and instead targets legitimate refugees, people who by definition have left their country of residence for fear of prosecution, people who have given up everything because they fear for their lives, people who believe Canada has not only a legal obligation, but a moral obligation to protect. Are these the people that this government really wants to victimize? As I said, there are problems with human smuggling and trafficking in Canada. But the major problem that we have with human smuggling has nothing to do with inadequate legislation, but to do with support and funding of the RCMP. The government wants to address the issue of human smuggling. We should ensure that people on the front lines have all the resources they need to do their job. Current legislation already allows for life sentences for individuals convicted of human smuggling. New legislation is not needed. What we need are the tools for better implementation of existing laws, not additional draconian legislation. Perhaps the most disturbing provision of this bill is the ability to arrest and detain any permanent resident or foreign national on suspicion of serious crime, criminality, or organized crime. Now think carefully about what this means. This provision means that any person in Canada who is not a citizen can become detained on the mere suspicion of criminality. No need for proof or evidence. Simple suspicion becomes enough to not only arrest, but also indefinitely detain people. The rule of law in a democracy is founded on the principle that the police's powers of arrest and detention are only legitimate if there are reasonable grounds for arrest. Specifically, the notion of reasonable grounds means that there must be an objective component to the notion of suspicion. This objective component is met by evidence. Suspicion alone is subjective. There is no way to prove whether that suspicion is warranted or not, and this leaves the system open to abuse. While Canadian citizens are not affected by this provision, this sets a worrying precedent. I am reminded of the famous quote by Martin Niemöller, which ends, "They came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Once we accept that arrest and detention without an objective reason is justified for foreign nationals and permanent residents, what is to stop the same government extending the provisions to include Canadian citizens? We cannot turn a blind eye now and hope that these disturbing changes are never applied to us. If we believe that arrest and detention without objective evidence is unacceptable when applied to ourselves, our friends and our families, then surely, Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable when applied to people who immigrated either permanently or temporarily to Canada. How would our government react to news that a Canadian citizen was arrested and detained abroad simply on the suspicion of criminality? I believe that the government, rightly, would be outraged and would call on the foreign government to provide evidence of wrongdoing, of any wrongdoing, Mr. Speaker, or release the person in question immediately. Canada should be a world leader in human rights and freedom, not a laggard whose legislation we could criticize in other states. And the NDP is not alone in opposing this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Amnesty International has said that the bill falls far short of Canada's international human rights and refugee protection obligations and will result in serious violations of the rights of refugees and migrants. The Canadian Bar Association, the voice of the legal profession in Canada, has stated that the previous version of this bill, introduced in the previous Parliament, violates charter protections against arbitrary detention and prompt review of detention, as well as Canada's international obligations respecting the treatment of persons seeking protection. The bill is opposed to the UN Convention relating to the status of refugee, which states, contracting states shall not impose penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence on refugees who, coming directly from a territory where their life or freedom was threatened in the sense of Article 1, enter or are present in their territory without authorization, provided that they present themselves without delay to the authorities and show good cause for their illegal entry or presence. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the government is on the wrong side, both on their legal obligations of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and various international treaties, as well as their moral obligations to the people fleeing persecution. Should this law pass, Mr. Speaker, the government will undoubtedly face years and years of expensive legal battles in the Supreme Court. Now is the time of the government to realize that this bill is flawed and to invest in the policing resources which will crack down on human smugglers and protect vulnerable refugees. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.